So if you need a VPN, go Nord. Use nordvpn.com/Kimber to get a huge discount off your Nord VPN plan plus 4 additional months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. Protect your computer like a cricketer protects its nether region with NordVPN today. Could you start with your name and job title, please?
Hi, Tim Wigmore. I'm a cricket writer for the Daily Telegraph and the author of White Hot.
To bowl quick, you need to run in at 23 to 24 kilometers per hour to the crease. Did you work this out, Wigmore, by doing it yourself?
I did not know, but I got England Wales cricket ball to do it for me, so I didn't have to.
How did you come across that?
So England, there was quite a lot of research, mainly in Australia and England, really. Australia probably actually had done historically a bit more than England on what it takes to bowl fast, because obviously nothing more valuable than a fast bowler, and nothing more annoying than having a great fast bowler who always gets injured. So Australia probably 15 years ago were the first country to really pay proper attention to this, and England have kind of followed suit. And it's obviously a huge issue. How can you bowl fast, A, and how can you bowl fast and not getting injured, B, which is just as important.
One of the things that you talked about was that, the javelin throwers. I know that Ian Pont, that was one of the things that he was very fascinated with early on, which was that fast bowling is probably most similar to javelin throws. I know it's a slightly different run up and everything else, but also the stopping after you bowl. So there is a connection between throwing a javelin and bowling fast, even if they are slightly different.
That's right, and both of them are actually very unnatural as things to do. They're very, you have to move your body in a very unnatural way. But the big difference here, people talk about the similarities between them, but in javelin, you only have to throw up to 9 times in a competition, so an over and a half. If you're a fast bowler, you might be bowling 40 or 50 overs in a test match. So I think we actually underestimate just how brutal the demands are for fast bowlers, and just how athletic you need to be able to do it, and to be able to do it time and again at 90 miles an hour and more. It's a serious pursuit, and there's not many things actually in sport as a whole that actually require you to be A, so athletic, and B, so durable at the same time, because it's both very, very explosive and you need to be very, very repeatable. It's very rare to have that combination of two things. Yeah,
you need to be a sprinter who can run a marathon, right? Like it doesn't necessarily make sense. So, I think the first time I saw it measured was the South Australian bowlers years ago, and we started to see how many kilometers that they were doing. You say that, and I think my memory of that was that the South Australian bowlers were covering about 38 to 40 kilometers per game for South Australia. You've got it as 50 kilometers that a fast bowler actually covers in movement during a test match.
Yeah, that's movement. I shouldn't say that's not all sprinting. So about 10k of that is in sprinting. A lot of it is actually moving from fine leg to fine leg. So actually, if you can field in the gully, or Pat Cummins mid off, that is a nice little advantage as well. It reduces your workload, which does matter. We haven't seen many great fast bowlers able to field closer in the ring, but if you can, obviously that's another demand. But also it does mean you have to travel a little bit less as far as well, which is a nice
I don't know if you remember, the John Buchanan obviously had some of this early information, and they tried to turn Jason Gillespie into a slip fielder or a gully fielder because of this. So we have seen it before. Obviously Joel Garner was a gully fielder.
Jimmy Anderson field,
yeah. Terry Alderman was a slip fielder as well. But I did go through it. There's very few permanent slip fielders in the history of cricket who have been specialist bowlers. So the vast majority of them are generally, Callis and Flintoff and Pollock, where they have some kind of batting skill. So there does seem to be a correlation between fielding at slip and being able to bat even just a little bit. So it is very hard to be, like Alderman, for instance, and Anderson cannot bat, right? It's very rare to have guys like that who are good in the slips. So there must be a connection between batting and fielding in the slips that is different. But if you can find a position for your fielder, because the funny thing is that there are a lot of bowlers you talk to who love going out to fine leg because they can zone out a little bit more than they can if they're up. But that's also because that's what we've been doing from childhood, right? if they've been fielding in better position. So if you do have a fast bowler at a young age, the best thing for you is to find a position for them in the ring, right? It just, you look at these numbers and there's just no argument.
Yeah, so if you can find a way of cutting down that distance, that's a huge thing. In terms of why, I mean, it might be that obviously as a batter you need to read the ball in the air and off the seam, which is similar to a slip fielder. And if you're, James Anderson is a brilliant bowler, you're less adept at doing that from the batting point of view. And also, it might just be like a lot of things in cricket because that's the way it's always been done. And we always had, if you're an amateur, you didn't want to field at third man or fine leg. You wanted to field at first, second slip, talk to your mate all day. And it might still be a bit of that thinking that still lingers in cricket. Never underestimate that in cricket.
That amateur stuff is really cool, actually. I don't know if you know, I don't know if you listened to the podcast I did the other day about when they had nets around. So instead of having a traditional boundary, when the ball was hit to the net, they would have to go and field the ball and you could keep running. And all those games, I think they had 5 trial games, and all the amateurs pulled out because they suddenly realized they were going to have to chase every ball to the boundary and fire it back in. And so literally was it Sussex or Kent? One of those teams had the most professionals they'd ever had in a cricket game before, based on that. So, I mean, you're right. And we also know that that is the way that batters think. What do they used to call it with the old Australian teams? They used to call it the Ansett Golden Wing, right? Like it is the cushy place to go. It's where you want to be able to go. So I think from that perspective, it's very fair. The other one,
there are some captains who like to field sometimes in the slips, and again, captains normally batters or mid off, and it's just seen as also the think tank of a team is normally made up of senior batters who again you like to have them close and around. Even if the captain's at mid off, you might have a couple of vice captain in the slips or whatever. So that's definitely a part of it as well, and it's just the way things have always been. I think in underage, under 13 cricket, people would just, without seeing any fielders, a coach would just tell the fast bowler to go to fine leg and the opening bat to go to first or second slip. That's kind of how it's always been.
Also, I always thought this with Alderman. Alderman was a first slip fielder and obviously was very, very good at it to do it at an international level. But that means that someone else has to field at first slip half the time. Right, like for the first 10 overs, their slip cordon is constantly changing. Whereas if it's batters, you don't have that problem. And even in Warren's situation, right, he becomes a very good slip fielder. And Vittori didn't, but there is another spinner.
Swan.
Might have been Swan was one, and then there's another one from New Zealand, maybe in the 70s, who was a slip fielder. I think was a spinner as well. I think I've got that right. And again, it's a little bit different because you're not changing the fast bowling slips. That Graham Swan is, every time a fast bowler is bowling, he's going to be in the slips. It's all very, very fascinating. Up the 23 to 24 kilometer an hour speeds that you need to bowl quick. That is faster than you can run on a treadmill. I'm also hoping that you did that as a test on yourself.
I did. I kept on going, and I just about held on. I was dragged back by the ECB's medical team. So no, it's a serious. It's pretty serious, and even you see Gus Atkinson recently. Actually, interesting because he kind of seems to jog in fairly gently, but he has this acceleration towards the end. But that's So even someone like him, who we think of as quite a gentle action, is still actually it's taken a lot out of him in terms of the sprint. Being able to do that again and again, one of the reasons we see so many injuries of fast bowlers, and also just bowlers not being able to maintain their speeds. It's such a big thing now. To actually, can you do it in your second, third spell? We've seen that with Ollie Robinson, even though he's not a kind of a 90 mile an hour bowler, but that's been a big issue in his Test career so far. So that's one of the huge things that actually is being measured now as well, because actually speed guns even 15 years ago not very 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 reliable, but actually now the fact that everything's being measured, that actually kind of puts more pressure on fast bowlers to be able to do this, because you can tell, is someone doing it, are they keeping their speeds over the day, over a match, and that's so that's something that can be
England. I mean, England don't just look at the speed of the bowler, though, do they? I don't know if other teams do this, but England actually look at the heart rate and the speed of the run-up, right? So they are looking at, because their big thing was they wanted to be able to know, and I think they invented this for Stuart Broad, if we're being honest, but I think they wanted to know if he was putting in as much on the spells when he wasn't taking lots of wickets compared to the spells when he was taking lots of wickets. I don't think it was just for Stuart Broad, but I think that was how they ended up using it. but it was a very particular thing where they were like, they could tell the effort levels of their bowlers, especially in the nets was the other big thing. We'd come out of a nets and go, well, you didn't try particularly hard in the nets today. Is there a problem? Is there an injury? Are you not feeling well? Do you need a rest or whatever, everything else? So England specifically are looking at, they're not just tracking the balls better. As you said, the ball tracking is a lot better now than it's ever been before, but they're not just tracking the balls correctly, are they? They are literally tracking the bodies of fast bowlers at every single available opportunity to them.
Yeah, and this is also because of the idea of the red zone, and the red zone is basically, you have this in other sports, is when someone is at massive risk of being injured. So England, by getting enough data, England like to be able to say, actually, Mark Wood, you're in the red zone, hence why he didn't play at Lords in the Ashes, for example, because they thought actually if he played, there was a big risk he'd break down over the game, even though he would have been kind of fit to bowl at the start of that match. That's a big thing, because we know from the research that if you lose a bowler during a match, during a test, it's catastrophic, really. And so this is another reason why the research is so important, because A, you really want these guys in your team, but you know the risk is so great if they break down. You're playing with 10 players. That's so difficult. So that's been another driver of this research, really. And I think simply just kind of seeing Australia, because Australia have had more than any other country, they've been able to produce all these quick bowls, which I guess is probably what we should talk about next.
Yeah, well, I mean, Australia makes sense, and I remember I've been writing about this a lot recently. And you and I are both working on books on sort of the history of cricket in two different sort of topics. So you and I have chatted about it, but I've been chatting to a lot of people about these sorts of topics of how cricketers are made in different situations and everything else. And I don't think people realize how different Australian conditions are to even South African conditions, right? It isn't like South African conditions are a combination of Australia and England, or Australia and New Zealand. And you even get some West Indian pitches, sometimes in South Africa. Whereas every Australian pitch has pace and carry. Even the SCG has, at various times in its history, had very good pace and carry. Even when they put these flat drop-in wickets in Wigmore, they still have pace and carry. And you see it in the overseas players' records. When they come to Australia, they really, really do struggle. And so, of course, of any place on earth, pace is... the two things that are most important are having bowlers over 6'4" and having bowlers, of whatever the fast, medium, or fast at that time is. That's what you need to be able to take wickets in Australia with. Yes,
even the Vernon Philander type of bowler, you don't really get in Australia. In fact, people thought Scott Boland was that bowler, but actually Scott Boland bowls at 85 mile an hour.
Yeah.
Scott Boland is Josh Tongue in terms of speed, which is a kind of a weird thing.
Well, I mean, it's a perfect example of, I think he was clocked at 87, 88 at times, right? And also because he's big and strong, but he's tall, right? So he still has one of those Australian characteristics.
High release point.
Yeah, like you look at guys like McGoffin and Nofke. Like Nofke played a little bit. McGoffin I never played for Australia, I don't think, in any format. But there are David Moody, who played club cricket in England a couple of years ago. Tom Moody. There's every state you go to has these guys who don't even play international cricket, and sometimes don't even play domestic cricket, who you play them in club cricket and they're 6'7" and 6'8", right? And they just wang the ball in halfway, back of a length, and there's nothing you can do against them. That in Australia is really hard to play. It's not quite as dominant in other parts of the world.
So I think it's a combination of basically pitches, climate, and culture. So to start, I think Australia, and this is England's view as well, is that Australian young cricketers actually specialise later than, say, in England, and you have this sort of general athleticism. And I suppose the cliche would bet you get these sort of surfers who are also demon fast bowlers. I think that is part of it in terms of actually this general. You
say surfers, also a snowboarder in Derek Nannis's case.
Yeah, but this general athleticism is really important. It's also important because it gives you that robustness, physical robustness. And obviously, the weird thing is if you become 6'6", you only would have had a growth spurt probably pretty late in your teens. So you don't necessarily need to have bowled a ton. So that's where bowling again is always different to batting, because bowling you don't actually need to bowl as much to become an elite bowler as you need to practice with the bat. So you can be a very good all-round sports person, and then you have a growth spell, whatever, and you have that physical robustness, and then you're kind of up and away, and you have this repeatability. And clearly, the pitches in Australia, we said, they reward bowling fast, and especially from this high release point as well. So in fact, maybe they don't reward it, but maybe they punish anything else massively. So you're kind of left with no alternative. Might be a better way of thinking about it. And even of course the climate, you don't get the kind of moisture in the wicket, the Darren Stevens wickets that you get in England. So in England, actually, one of the funny things is, if you look at the ball tracking in county cricket, basically if you bowl over 87 miles an hour, you actually average more than if you bowl between sort of 80 and 85. So you basically get punished.
I mean, that is one of the weirdest stats I've ever heard, because when you would think that any bowler who could bowl over 87 miles an hour in county cricket is getting some kind of deviation still, right? Just because England wickets are more, the Duke's ball and the wickets, and as you said, the Darren Stevens sort of wobbly wickets. So the fact is that I think we have always thought that there should still be more quick bowlers in England. We know what happened. The Darren Gough stories are, a really famous story of literally, I think it was Richie Richardson, who was his captain, hadn't come up and said, why are you not bowling as fast as you can every ball? Whereas most people in English cricket were told specifically not to bowl as fast as they could every ball. But now we have data that actually says, well, there is a reason. Why would you, if you have a fast bowler in England, you'd actually be better to say to them, bowl at 85 miles an hour the majority of the time in county cricket, and then when we need you to bowl at 95 miles an hour, when we're playing in a flat wicket in Bridgetown, or when we're playing at Adelaide Oval, that's when we want you to use it. That's almost counterintuitive again to how we've ever thought about fast bowling in England, right?
This also speaks to the schedule, which is a big difference between England and Australia. Just the sheer volume of cricket you play in England, it's exhausting. You have most times this season played 7 rounds in 8 weeks in April and May. So you just cannot do that and bowl 90 mile an hour all the time. So you have to pay yourself back. In fact, we saw this with Hardisvillian. So he went as a Colpack, got one of the last Colpack deals. He comes to England for a few years. He does very well. His stats are very good. But he comes back, and the South Africans are like, "What did you do with him? You just killed 10 miles an hour. What have you done to him? He was this express fast bowler. He's come back. He's another very good English team. We don't want that. So there's something.
I reckon the amount of times I would watch these. I remember. Do you remember Robbie Joseph from Kent was one that I remember. Chris Jordan was another one. God, what's his name? The big guy that ended up at Kent, who I think played for Durham. You would watch them in their first year in county cricket, and you'd be like, "Whoa, this guy!" And then you watch them in year 3 and 4, and you're going, "Oh, okay, they're just a bowler now." Like, it was so noticeable how much pace they. Do you remember Mark Foote, the Derby and Surrey player? He was one of the few that I reckon from beginning to end was genuinely quick, almost all the way through. Whereas and you get it. They play so much cricket. They have no breaks. I remember, George Bailey retiring early from Hampshire because he got sciatica on the bus, right? Well, if you're a fast bowler, that's going to be even worse for you, right? Being in the buses, driving all the time, and all that sort of stuff that these England players do, changing between formats. It is almost incredible that they have any fast bowlers in England.
Yeah, and also the other thing we haven't mentioned is the run. Sometimes your run up, you can be quite worried about the ground kind of giving way underneath you. So again, you're going to be quite keen to rein your pace back in if that means your run up is a little bit less manic as well. So yeah, it's the whole system is basically, it doesn't reward you. And this is actually, to be fair to England are aware of this. Josh Tongue, I think he averaged 38 this season when he was picked by England. He did well in those 2 tests he played. So England are aware that the county system is just not producing, it's not rewarding the right kind of behaviour. So county cricket will never be as good as international cricket. But basically what you find historically in the Sheffield Shield is more or less you could pick a Sheffield Shield, a dream team Sheffield Shield, and might be 2 or 3 players different from the test team, but it will be more or less there. You pick a dream county cricket 11 from English qualified players. It might only have two literally a couple of players who are actually England players. So you have, it's not rewarding the same types of players. So you have, it's actually very hard. It's quite hard as selectors because one thing just doesn't transfer. And again, because of the Sheffield Shield is always basically head. If you can get wickets in the Sheffield Shield, you'll get wickets at Test cricket. If you can get wickets at county cricket, it just doesn't tell you anything about whether you'll get wickets for England.
Well, I did that piece. I must have been around the Edgbaston Test where they had all the medium fast bowlers, right? Where Broad and Anderson had slowed down, and Ollie Robertson and everyone else was playing. And you look at the history of these guys who played, in the 1930s or the 1950s or 1960s and 1970s, and they come in and they end up with bowling averages for England of like 22 and 25 and 26. They'd not even tried overseas, right? They play them at home, they dominate teams at home, and the minute they go overseas, they just pick random bowlers from. So this isn't a new thing. Like England has been aware of this for a very, very long time. The interesting thing for me is I know you're an expert on this. Is New Zealand basically changed their DNA by changing their wickets, but it's easy to do in New Zealand because the domestic teams don't really have any power. Right. Whereas in county cricket, the domestic teams do have a lot of power over their pitches. They have local crowds and everything else. But I look at England in the long term over the next 20 years. And I do wonder how will they ever consistently produce fast bowlers without completely changing the county system or top line spinners? Because it's exactly the same for spin bowling. I can't think of another, it's a bit like maybe Sri Lanka might be the only other hardcore example of this, where it's actually very hard for Sri Lanka to actually have anything outside of spinners because their domestic wickets are so I love it when I remember a couple of years ago when Australia played over there and all the Australian press were like, oh, they're going to give us a raging Turner in Gaul, and I was like, have you seen the first class records of these games in Gaul? A normal pitch is a raging Turner in Gaul, right? Like, and it's exactly the same for England, but with these green wickets, and everywhere. I'd even go as far as to say this. Maybe one thing that they could do in county cricket would be not to use the Duke's balls, right? And make people actually work harder with Kookaburra or someone else's balls for the same reasons.
Yeah, of course. This summer they've done that. They've had two rounds each of trial with the Kookaburra balls. Yep. So they are trying that. Yeah, I think
unlike the year, Wigmore, when they used the Tiflex balls and actually made them swing more than Duke's balls.
Yeah, and which was the year, that was 2011. That was the first year of Darren Stevens when he became the monster that is Darren Stevens. So yeah, you have this basically to be a successful test team. Ideally, you would have your domestic conditions would basically be in the middle of test cricket. It'd be about average for the amount of seam bowled, amount of spin bowled, and you produce bowlers that could kind of do it anywhere. So England do have this problem where the fact English first class cricket is better supporters than anywhere in the world is kind of a good thing and a curse at the same time, basically. And you do go back to all the things about the schedule and stuff. And actually, if you could you essentially contract the ground staff, for example, things like that. But actually talk to the ground staff. There's just so much, buddy. There's so much cricket played. It's really difficult. You go to Sheffield Shield. It's 5. You're preparing for 5 home matches a season versus 7 in the championship, plus all the short format games. Again, a lot more of those. So it all makes it very, very difficult. And yeah, again, the incentives of the England team and counters are not really aligned, which is why England are going to need to be, and they are being, to fairness to them, they're kind of being creative. But ideally, you would want a system where your domestic schedule, you can basically be a selector just from looking at the numbers, which you could, historically, you've kind of been able to do that in Australia. If you'd always gone an Australian team based on the numbers, you wouldn't have gone too far wrong. England, you'd have been terrible.
I love the idea of just England going all in on the data and just Darren Stevens and JB Porter opening the bowling. One other thing, we've been talking about fast bowling, but there was one thing. I think it was Dr. John Orchard. Did you talk to him for this piece, or did you find? Yeah. So I think he probably knows more about fast bowlers' bodies than almost anyone, throughout the history of the sport. He has so much data and, obviously hugely important for Cricket Australia. He said something that that studies from the 80s showed that up to 90% of fast bowlers had unhealed stress fractures on X-ray, which is incredible. But the other thing he said was that the best predictor for whether someone can bowl fast is if they don't get injured a lot consistently as well. And so you look at Jofra Archer and Mark Wood and James Pattinson, and you're just like, sadly, there's not much we can do for them. We can try and, help them out, but essentially they have the physical characteristics that allow them to bowl very, very fast, but they don't have the ability to do that consistently because their bodies just can't maintain it.
Yeah, and also, people talk about with Jofra, his braced front leg is kind of what makes him so quick, but it's also what makes him so injury prone. So it's kind of what makes him so good, but also not on the park that often as well. So Australia, so 2008, they started from bowlers as young as 16. They would do X-rays to basically look for stress fractures. And this obviously leads to Pat Cummins at one point being, the best paid cricketer who never actually plays. So he goes, 6 years after his test debut of not playing a test match. Which a lot of people, to be fair, I bet you got a lot of kind of former players being like, this is ridiculous. He keeps being ruled out with his stress fractures. But actually, you've had reward. You've had 6 years of him being been basically on the park the whole time, and that's the payoff. And he's probably got a few more
Well,
years.
you've got 6 years of him basically being Glenn McGrath, right?
So it has been worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a weird one because I get what the old players are saying, but at the same time, I always go back to the Dirk Nannes thing. Dirk Nannes obviously had this random story where he becomes a professional cricketer at 28, 29 after being a professional in snowboarding before that. But he said that if he'd started, he could bowl just as fast when he was 19 or 20, but he would have ruined his body if he'd done it then. There is, for certain people, there is a science of that, right? That does make sense when you start to look at these numbers.
Even with Mark Wood, his best bowling, both in terms of results and in terms of fitness, has been 31, 32 off. He's 33 now, and he's bowling as well as ever. He's better than ever. So, yeah, there is something to be said for. But yeah, Australia have been the most proactive in taking this approach, and I think the fact we've had Stark, Hazelwood, and Cummins actually had very long careers. Basically, I think it's borne it out. But clearly, of course, you might have an undiagnosed stress fracture. That being diagnosed, you're then ruled out for a certain bit, and then you break your ankle anyway, and you have a period where you could have played. So it's one of those weird strategies, which is probably good on average, but for some players, it might leave them worse off in terms of shorter careers, and on average, it'll leave them a bit better off. So it's a tricky one, but yeah, clearly, if you have a pool of fast bowlers like Australia have, that makes it easier to pull off than if you just have one or two. But I think we should also mention that, the historic, what about Fred Truman and stuff? Actually, look at Fred Truman. He plays 20 tests away from home in his whole career. So not very much. So someone like him is having most winters more or less off. He's bowling a hell of a lot from April to September, but he's having 6 months a year, 6-7 months a year off of not really bowling. And that is a change. So it's more demanding now. It's also, you talk about Australia v England. Australian bowlers, they just bowl less. Australia have a less mad schedule than England. Play about a third less days of cricket, fewer days of cricket, which is quite a big difference. So that makes it easier to manage as well. And it's why England, again, have a very much, white ball cricket now is all about peaking at world events, and they're trying not to basically waste overs on these guys. I think South Africa were one of the first to do that very well. With Dale Steyn, he plays very little white ball cricket outside of ICC events, and that's probably he's actually probably not quite as good a white ball bowler as he is a test bowler, but I think actually the fact he's able to do that helps him play 90 tests and bowl so quickly for.
Of course, they then did the opposite with Rabada and almost killed him. But that was obviously more political than anything else. But the other thing I find really, really interesting is that there's no physical characteristics that make sense for someone bowling 90 miles an hour. Like Jofra Archer and Ryan Harris, right? And Tino Best and Sean Tate. These people don't...
Look at Mitchell Stark and Mark Wood in the last Ashes.
Yeah. It's a really interesting thing to me, and I know that traditionally, that sort of Fred Truman big fat ass was that they thought that that had something to do with it, and that might have had something to do with the back when it was a back foot no ball calling. I don't know if that was part of it, but I was always told that's what you needed, a big fat ass to be able to bowl quick. And we see Brett Lee has a great ass, and then Shoaib Akhtar, little bit of an ass, but some of these modern guys have no ass to speak of. Wigmore, right? Like it is such a fascinating thing to me that there are so many completely different kinds of bowlers who can bowl regularly over 90 miles an hour, and that for all the science we know that fast twitch muscle fiber obviously plays a part, but also people bowl fast in very, very different ways, like technique wise to each other. It's a fascinating point there. And the one last thing, someone asked me this, I think it might have been on Wagon Wheel the other day, have we reached peak pace, right? And I thought no. Yeah. And part of the reason I think no is because we don't even know what the best body type or the best action is to bowl as fast as possible. I know you've thought about that before. With everything you know now, do you think we've reached peak pace?
I think so. If you look at what's happened with pace, I think we basically agree that peak pace has probably gone up a little bit. What's gone up a lot is guys who can bowl consistently over 87 into the 90s, and that probably will continue to go up. We haven't had, of course, we've had Ali Khan, but he moved to America rather than grew up in America. But we haven't had a really homegrown American who's been through the kind of American sport science element. That would be really interesting. Guy that gets a sports scholarship to college in the US, that sort of thing.
You're looking for an Ohio State Buckeye type 90 mile an hour bowler.
He's been through the kind of maybe bit of the baseball system as well. That would be interesting. But I think you look. Yeah, so you look at the 30 years ago, and it's definitely the sort of the fifth fast bowlers today is much quicker than the fifth fast bowler a generation or two ago. Where the top is not quite straightforward. I think we probably have 1 or 2 miles an hour left in, but I don't think a huge amount more. But I think we could have. I mean, Mark Wood is getting there, Armit Norkir, in terms of, their stop. Talk about effort balls and everything, but kind of forget that in terms of their stop ball basically being a 93 mile an hour ball. I think that's what we're getting towards, which is that is something really.
Tim Wigmore, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Cheers.